going because my timer's counting down even though my watch says we're not quite on time yet. But before we get going, I want to make sure that none of you are wasting your time here. So I want to kind of level set on what this session is because there may be some misconception depending on how you read the abstract for it. This is not a session on test-driven development. If you are looking to see a session on TDD or BDD or any of a various different set of varieties dealing with unit testing, this is probably not the right session. The other thing also is that I'm not showing anything from Visual Studio vNext. So if you are looking for that, I don't have anything to show there. I'm not going to be offended if anyone gets up and walks out. I want to make sure this is relevant to you, and if you are here, that you're getting something out of it. So, having said that, my name's Jeff Levinson. I'm a senior ALM consultant with Northwest Cadence, and my focus is process and methodology. I am the author of a new book on software testing with Visual Studio 2010, and the material that we are going to cover today is getting developers and testers working together better. So you are going to see some unit testing, you're going to see a lot of MTM, you're going to see some automation, and you're going to see traceability. And you're going to see a tool that I wrote to kind of help pull this together that's available for everybody. So that's where we'll begin. Also, while we're going, please feel free to ask questions during it. You can always ask questions at the end as well, but I prefer to take questions as they come up. So software development today, how many of you go through a churn where once the developers start coding things, you get into this break-fix cycle where you're constantly fixing code that is broken? Either testers find the breaks or users find the breaks. How many of you does that apply to? Okay, a little bit more than half. All right, it's a fairly common scenario. And the process that we go through is pretty straightforward, right? We gather our requirements. Even if you're doing agile development, you gather requirements in some way, shape, or form. You design it, sometimes. You code it. Maybe you design it after you code it. That works also. Occasionally, you'll write test cases. How many of you write test cases right now? How many of you write those test cases after the developer is done working? A fair number. So after you're done coding, and assuming you're not on this really short timeline, you may get to test it. It depends. When budget goes out the window, typically the first thing that goes out the window after the budget is the testers. You'll get to user acceptance tests eventually, and then you get into the situation where the user goes, that's not what I wanted. So as kind of a story to illustrate this, about 10 years ago, I was working as a software developer for a very large company. And this was back in VB6 time frame. And I was given a 600-page specification to go code. And the reason why it was 600 pages is because the business analyst fancied himself an amateur developer, so he actually designed all my screens for me and all of my buttons, and he even told me that the button names were like BTN submit. And he gave me the size and the position and everything. It was really great, 600 pages. I went off and coded it for 6 months. It was probably... I was actually more proud of that than anything I'd ever coded before. It was sweet. It was this VB6 app that had graphics and you could drag boxes around and reorder stuff and data class. It was really awesome. I finally, after 6 months, got to show it to the user. They didn't let developers talk to the user much. And I showed it to the user and I said, what do you think? And the user looked at me and goes, well, that's great. Is it going to do what we want it to do in the next release? That is what happened. I actually didn't have any tests to work on. The business analyst wrote the tests afterwards and didn't share the tests with me because he didn't feel that was relevant. So that was a little bit of a problem. And we had testers, but I wasn't allowed to work with the testers because they were in a different building. That's a pretty common process that we all go through. And we go through a lot of churn and a lot of wasted time and energy. So let's look at how we go about doing this. How do we get into the situation that we're in? So let's take a scenario. I have a daughter, 3 years old, very cute, and I want her to be successful. So what do? If you want her to be successful, maybe I'm going to tell her to go to a university, go to a college, get a degree. In order to go get a degree, she's got to do two things. She's got to go fill out an application, and she's got to take the SAT. I'm pretty sure most people here probably have taken the SAT. And to pass the SAT, what do? We need to study math and English. Now, they don't tell us what the questions are. They just say, go do this, and maybe you'll pass the test if you do enough stuff that doesn't apply to what we actually want you to do, just so you got kind of this broad understanding of it. So if we develop software, the way that people, for example, have to take the SAT or go after other goals where they don't really know what they're doing, but they've got to go build something anyways, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Wait a second. We do build software that way. I know, I've been there and I've done it, and probably most of you have also. It's tough to do. And it's tough to hit the mark on the first time. I don't know, how many of you had to take the SAT more than once? Okay, there's like 6 of us. The rest of you are rocket scientists. So, for the 6 of us who weren't really good at this, I had to take it twice. It was hard because I didn't know what I was trying to aim for. That's the same problem in software development. People know it, but they're not doing anything to change it. So, at the end of the day, what are we talking about? The definition of done. Anyone want to throw out the definition of done for me?
When the check clears.
When the check clears. Fantastic. Okay, that is one way. When I get paid, that's good. Other definitions of done. When the budget runs out. Okay, there's another good one. Any other options? When the problem changes. Well, then you're not really done, right? Then you just get to keep going and you get another check, right? And you can keep going until the budget runs out again. Any other definitions of done? When the end user's happy and sometime after you start. Okay, when the end user's happy, let's take that. That's kind of an interesting definition. So when the end user is happy. When is the end user happy? Do any of you guys know end users who are happy? I don't. Sorry, I'm losing my voice and I'm sucking on throat lozenges, so excuse me. So when the end user is happy, how do we measure end user happiness with software that we develop? Anyone want to throw out an idea? They stop yelling. Okay, that's one way of doing it. Yeah, they stop yelling and throwing things. That's really good. The reality of it is that the end user being happy is very not measurable. I can't test to see whether the end user is happy. I mean, I suppose I could. You know, if I walk in and told him a joke and he laughs, he's happy. If not, then maybe not. But that's not a really great way for developers and development teams to figure out when they are done with something that they are going to deliver. And we see this a lot. The definition of done has come up more and more recently, especially in agile development circles, where they first tell you, when you're starting a sprint, especially in Scrum, define the definition of done when you're starting a project so that you know when you're done. Most teams that I work with do not define the definition of done well. So, what's the definition of done? At the end of the day, the definition of done is when my test cases pass. Theoretically, I've shared my test cases with my customer, and my customer agrees that these are the right test cases that I should be building to. How many of you do that today? A couple. I see maybe about 5 or 6 hands. How many of you are using a tool that integrates the testers and the developers? How many are using TFS 2010 or Visual Studio and Visual Studio 2010? Okay, so you guys are using tools that integrate the developers and testers. You're just not using it in an integrated fashion. So a lot of this talk is going to be focused on how to get them together and how to make sure that the developers and testers are working towards the same goal, and it's a goal you can hit the first time. I like to know I can actually finish something before I start. So where does this problem come from? It comes from the standard V model of engineering. Most of you should probably be familiar with this. Down the left-hand side, we've got the business drivers and the requirements, the stuff that the customers give us. And going up the right-hand side, we've got the verification of those requirements. Now let's think about this for a second. We are taking a subjective document, a business goal, business driver, requirement, and we are validating it objectively. Anyone think that works really well? No one willing to say anything. Okay. It doesn't, because what happens is when you start validating it, the customer goes, that's not what I meant. Right? That's a problem. It's a pretty common phrase that customers tell us. And when you look at this, usually the business analyst is responsible for the business driver and the requirement. The developer is responsible for the tasks, the unit tests, and the code, and the tester is responsible for the functional tests and the system integration tests. Guess who wins at the end of the day? The tester. And the developer and the tester are interpreting requirements differently than the business analyst maybe. So right away, you're setting yourself up for failure if you do software development that way. And this has been ingrained into us, right? It's been beaten into us since we start doing software development, that this is the way we do software development. I'd like to propose that this is not a good way of doing software development and that there are a lot of flaws with this. But there's a simple fix. What if I take the standard V model and I flip it? Same model, I've just reversed both legs. Now, my system and integration tests, my functional tests, and my unit tests come first. I am driving down towards my development against an objective specification, and I am validating the outcomes as I go up the other side of the model. Because here's the problem with requirements. Requirements tell you what the customer wants the system to do and wants the system to be. It doesn't tell you the outcome. It says the system should be able to do this, or the system shall do this, or I want the system to do this. But it doesn't tell you, if I have a calculator, for example, that if I put 2 in here and 2 in here and I hit plus, I get 4 out of the back end. It tells you I want to add numbers. But there's no way that you can validate successfully something that's objective. So if we look at flipping the V model, what I'm calling the reverse V model, we start getting somewhere. Now I know I can hit my goals. I know when a system and an integration test pass because there is no maybe in a test case. It either passes or it fails. There's no two ways about it. It passes or it fails. It doesn't maybe pass or partially pass. It passed or failed. So starting at the top with the business drivers, how many of you are told to go build a new system and you don't understand where it fits in the business? How many people? Only a couple people raise their hand, but other people say daily. Okay. If everyone's not just being after lunch tired, which I understand they serve turkey with tryptophan in it, so that was a good choice. So you guys are all wide awake for this session. Have Diet Coke. A lot of times this isn't the case. When I was developing the application that I was writing for 6 months, I went away and did it, I actually had no idea where it fit in the overall business. I had no idea what value it provided. I did not have any way to know whether or not what I was doing was actually directly affecting the goals of the system. It turned out that the reason why the user didn't want the software that I wrote was because it actually did not help drive the goals of the system, which she knew about and the business analyst knew about, but I didn't. So your business goals, they need to be smart. And more importantly, they need to be the M in there, measurable. You need to be able to actually test that the application meets your business goals. Going down into the requirements, you're going to break those requirements down. You're going to take the goal. It's not necessarily important that you read what's on there. But you're going to take the goal. You're going to break it down into requirements. You're going to break it down into scenarios. You're going to break it down into tests. This is where it gets important. How many of your testers work with your developers? How many people here, their testers work with their developers on a daily basis? A lot of people. And yet, a lot of people rose their hand earlier when I asked and I said, do you guys go through the churn of having things fail tests and going back to the developers again? Or have things fail UAT and go back to new requirements, change requests, or new features in Agile? That means there's a problem in how the testers and developers are working together. I would suggest that it's partially tool-based and it's partially process-based. I am going to show you the tool-based way of getting out of this. So this is Visual Studio 2010, TFS 2010, nothing special here. And I have an application with some requirements in here. You can see I've got to submit a travel expense, approve a travel expense, create a calculator to support the expense function, the expense application. It's kind of basic stuff. If I drill down into the user story, and you can do this with the Agile template or the CMMI template, doesn't matter. Different work item types, but same process. So in the user story, you notice I've got a couple things. First, I've got test cases Theoretically, at this point, I haven't started developing anything. Obviously, I'm not going to develop anything up here, so bear with me on this. Do as I say, not as I do. I've got my test cases, and the test cases don't actually have anything in them. There's no test steps there. It's just the title. But the title of this is testable. It's what we call an acceptance criteria. Under which criteria will you accept this particular story? How many of you create acceptance criteria before you start working? Wow. Okay, that's a little lower than what I thought. 3 people raised their hands. If you don't know what you're trying to achieve, you can't achieve it. You can't hit there. So, right at the beginning, just by creating test cases, I already know that in this submitting a travel expense, that I as a developer need to do 3 things. I need to have it approved one way if it's less than $2,000. I know that the financial person can't disperse money until it's been approved, and if it's more than $2,000, not only does the manager have to approve it, but the department head has to approve it. Now, it's high level. It doesn't give you a lot of details, but neither necessarily does the requirement that I get, and 600 pages of documentation doesn't necessarily help me. If in the requirements you get something like the button should be this size and the button should have this label and it should be this color and I should get this message when I click the button, does that actually help drive towards what the application is supposed to be doing? And the answer is no. It's fluff. It's stuff that's not really important. I can change a user interface anytime I want to change a user interface. I can't just rip out business logic and change it. We'll get to that part of the story also. But right here, I've got my test cases. And my test cases help me drive what the functionality is that I need to be able to implement. So I can create tasks here. Build the approval UI, build the submission UI, build the expense logic. This is telling me what I need to do to meet the needs of the test. Now, at this point, I'm not working off of a subjective requirement. I'm working off of an objective test case. I know I can hit it. And developers are not likely to miss the mark when you tell them exactly what needs to happen, because you're telling them this is what the outcome must be. You're not saying you need to go through a different path to if you spend less than $2,000 or a different path if you spend more than $2,000. You're saying if you do this, this is what you get out the back end. One of the benefits of this, and doing it this way, is that as a developer, I have visibility on this. So I've got a customer. They use Quality Center. How many of you use Quality Center? Okay, good number of people, about a quarter, a little less than a quarter of the people. It's a good tool for managing test cases, and you can even manage requirements in it. Does it integrate with Visual Studio or any other tool that the developers use? No. So when a developer breaks down tasks, how do they trace the tasks back to the requirements that they're supposed to do? You can't. You can't. You can do pen and paper, or a developer can always have the Quality Center window open so that they can kind of see it, but there's no traceability. They are working in a vacuum, and the vacuum's got to go away. So by building the test cases first, if the developer's working to the test cases and not the requirement, you get the traceability right off the bat. So I've got a couple of other tasks here. Create the expenses table, execute the test cases. We always put in tasks for executing and creating test cases so I can track time. Different story. But this is traceable. I can go look at my submit travel expenses. I can look at the implementation and I can say, okay, here are the tasks that I'm doing to do it. Here are the test cases. That's all available to me as a developer. Now, where do I go from here? I already showed the test case doesn't actually have anything in it. So let's take the test case and add something into it. Now, how many of you have been to Brian Keller's talks earlier in the show? Only a few. How many of you are familiar with MTM? Not that many. Okay. All right, well, Microsoft Test Manager, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, is Microsoft's new user interface for testers to be able to create, edit, and execute test cases, both manual and automated. And right here, you can see that I've got a submitted travel expense. And that's my requirement, and you can see here that I can actually click on my requirement. So again, the testers can look at everything as well. They're not working in any type of vacuum either. Oops. Really went the wrong way. Let's do that again. Oh, wrong test case. Okay, so in here, if I put in, let's see, user, enter the receipt date, category, and amount, and save it. Okay, simple test case. It's a one-liner. It's the beginning of the project. I don't actually know what fields are going to be there. I don't know what they're named. I don't know what the forms are called. I don't know what I'm supposed to be opening. But what did I just do? I just told the developer that you need the date that the receipt was for, that you need the category that the receipt is in, and that you need the amount that the receipt was for. I just gave them a mini data model. In most requirements, you're not going to see that. In most requirements, you're going to say, we need to submit an expense, and the customer keeps thinking of different things that they want to add to that. But there's no way for you to hit a moving target, pretty much ever. In this way, if I can get the customer to agree that if I submit these things and it saves it, then we're good. Customer signs off on it, you write code that actually does this, and you're done. No gold plating, no extra things. I'm not talking about buttons or forms or anything else, technologies, web forms, Win forms, it doesn't matter. I'm talking about functionality, and if my application meets this functionality, I'm good. And having done that and made that change there, when I refresh this, my developer can see it as well. So my developer now knows exactly what to do to get this test case executed and run. And the beauty about this is that this is now traceable all the way up and down the line. Even when the developer checks in code, that code is associated with the task, which is associated with the user story, which is associated with the test case. I can trace all the way up and down the line. And sometimes it helps to visually take a look at this. So one of the things I'm going to show here, and I'm showing this because I built this because I'm a visual person. I need to actually see what's going on. And if I can't see it, I can get kind of lost. So this is the Architecture Explorer. For those of you who were in Peter's session earlier, he showed this. And the Architecture Explorer doesn't look like much now, but let's zoom in and actually take a look and see what we've got here. So what this is a breakdown of all my user stories and all of my tasks and all of my test cases and my test results. It's all traceable, it's all visible. I can see it. I can understand what's going on here. So I have created a calculator application to support the expense application. Different requirement. I'm working on two different projects here. And I can even click it and bring up that particular item so that I can actually see what's going on. But in this way, I can pretty much easily trace however it is that I want to do this, and I understand where my test cases were, what they executed against, and whether or not they passed or failed. And you can do various different things with this designer. You can group things and be able to drill down in things so you can see which test runs things were done in. But this type of traceability, really before you get to writing code, because at this point, I've created a test case and I've told the developer, go write code. So any questions on this? And really what I'm trying to get across here is the traceability, is that by developers and testers working together here, they can do a better job. And also, you're not going to find bugs going through testing anymore. Why? Because the developer executed the test cases first. They're not giving them to testers who have never seen it before and never executed, and it's never been executed before. How many of you have developers give code to testers, and testers have never tested it, developers have never seen the test cases, and it comes back? How many of you have a 50% failure rate first time through? Fair number of people, and that's actually low for some shops. This process takes a little bit more work up front, and it reduces that number drastically. Just a little bit of work can reduce that number to almost zero, because if a developer's already run the test case, there's really no reason why a tester should ever see it fail. It gives them time to do exploratory testing. Yeah? Huh? So the question is what's left with your testers? Are there any testers here? There's a few. Okay. I'm not going to tell you what he said because that's bad. No, you're not going to kick your testers out of the company. What this lets happen is testers can focus on more exploratory testing and more deep business logic that you may not get from higher level test cases. And there are always going to be bugs with software, right? I mean, even with this, once you start integrating systems together, you're going to find problems. The issue is how much time do testers have to test those things? Because what typically happens, and anyone can call out and tell me if this is wrong, if you've got a professional testing shop, you may have built up hundreds of test cases in inventory, and you're going into a release, and they say, you've got 3 days to do your testing. And you're like, well, wait a second, I've got 2,000 test cases to run. What do I do? You don't have time to run 2,000 test cases. You never do. And like I said, when budgets get short, and again, anyone can disagree with me, the first thing that goes is testing. It goes right out the window. So in this case, we're front-loading our testing. And the testers are still going to be there to backstop us, still going to be there to do regression testing, but they're going to find deeper bugs that may be bigger problems than just getting normal stuff done. So, the other part is you need testers up front writing these test cases to begin with. And the reason for that is that testers typically are very, very diligent about making sure that everything logically flows together. As a developer, I just wanted to always code the coolest, latest thing. I didn't necessarily logically think everything through. Testers tend to logically think things through better than developers do. It's not that developers can't do it, it's just that that's the tester's job, and they generally do it well. It takes a certain type of person to be a tester. Other questions? Yes?
How do we combine user stories or test cases into one requirement?
How do you combine user stories and test cases into one requirement? I'm not sure.
The idea is great. We have requirement as a document, as a novel. This is much better idea, but how do we now combine?
Okay, so, right, so how do you combine them? Okay, I did a little bit of hand waving. I didn't actually show you doing this, so I might as well take some time and show you how to do it. So, creating a new work item, it's as simple as this. You can do it via the web, you can do it via MTM. However it is you want to do this. We'll just call this requirement 1. I've created a requirement. And I'm probably going to fill in something here so I know what the requirement is, although half the time I get users telling me, we would just like to do X. And I'm like, what's X? I had a user submit a bug to me the other day, and the bug said, this field didn't work. I didn't even know what system he was talking about, but he wanted me to fix it next week. And it was like, excuse me? So you'll fill something in. Now you notice the description here. It says description with acceptance criteria. So you can do acceptance criteria a couple ways. One, you can just put the acceptance criteria in here on what is it going to take for me to accept this. Or you can start creating high-level acceptance criteria. So one of the things that's great about this is if I go to the Test Cases tab and I simply select New, all I have to do is put in my title. And I can put it a comment if I want. Now I've got my relationship. Theoretically, that title is a short summary of my test case. You can even nest test cases so that you have high-level test cases that are your acceptance criteria and break them down into specific test cases, right? Because just because, for example, the test case is I want to be able to add 2 numbers together, there's a lot of different things that fall out into the being able to add 2 numbers together. So we want to get into specifics. But just doing this, you're probably ahead of where you are now. And everything's traceable, so it's not stored outside. And I think there was a little bit of a hint in your question of what do I do when I've got big requirements with big documents? This is a true. This. Right. So this is a tree. So in this view, you can see that I can actually collapse this. And you can see I've got 1 user story and I've got 3 test cases. So you can actually go as deep as you want in this tree. It's not a one-to-one relationship. And it can get complicated, right? Because test cases can test more than one requirement, which you can do here. You can associate a test case with multiple requirements and still get the full traceability all the way up and down the line. Same thing with bugs. If I file a bug, I can associate that bug with multiple requirements as well. So that traceability exists in a tree form. It's not one-to-one. And it's really simple to start off doing this. A lot of people, when they start doing this, don't they kind of try and do a lot of advanced stuff really quickly instead of easing into the process, and it does take easing into. I will tell you, I'm coaching a team right now. They've been telling me for 5 sprints that they're going to start writing test cases first. They keep not doing it, and they keep failing their tests when they get to the end of their sprint. So it's something to start off and ease into. So does that help? Okay. Other questions on this? Yes? Yep. Goes off and starts writing test cases. Okay. Okay. So the scenario that, I'm sorry, what's your name? Anton? The scenario that Anton brought up was, well, we go into a Scrum meeting, a planning meeting, and I've got my developers and testers sitting there for the first time, and the end user, the product owner, that's the first time they reveal the user stories to the developers and testers, and the developers estimate it, and then they go off and start coding, and the testers at the same time go off and start writing test cases. In that particular case, we recommend a slight shift. And for those of you who are hardcore Scrum people, you're probably not going to like me all that much, but bear with me. I think it's better to write some test cases up front so that as the owner in your product backlog, you can write 3 test case titles. That's not that hard for somebody to put in there. The product owner can do it, but it's better to have a tester do it so they've got a little bit of foreknowledge of it. In terms of the staggering of work, I like to have testers start a day or so early so that they can do this. So at the end of the last sprint, because the team, so there's one team that I have been coaching that is doing this. The testers, because they never find bugs at the end, actually have some free time at the end of a sprint. I have them starting to write up test cases for the next sprint. It becomes a little easy. Sometimes developers get distracted with the new stuff coming in because they see it in TFS. But a slight schedule change gets you out of that problem. Because otherwise, you are still setting yourself up for failure because, again, it's the situation of I have a requirement, I've got 2 groups interpreting it separately, but at the end of the day, the requirement is not what the developers need to code to. They need to code to what the testers are doing because the testers are the ones who say whether or not this passes or fails. So consider shifting your schedule a little bit. Other questions on this? Yes? Okay, so complex requirements and how you go about breaking this down. Is that right? Okay, so when you do have complex requirements, and I work at some companies who, they've got some very complex requirements, the issue is decomposition. And I will tell you, as an industry, we do a really poor job of decomposition. Agile teams do a better job because they're kind of forced to do a better job in those small iterations. And waterfall teams pretty much don't decompose. They sort of build as they go usually. They do high-level decomposition, but not as granular as Agile teams do. So one of the things is to stop using Word documents for your requirements. If you need to put your requirement into a Word document, it's too big for me to develop. It's too big. If I get a 10-page requirements document, I'm toast. There's no way I'm going to be able to do it. I can break that down into 10 more requirements. So I actually like moving things out of documentation and into TFS. Why? I can't search documentation usually. I can search things in TFS with a little bit of work. But it's there for me to look through in SQL Server. It's there for me to look through in a UI or an Outlook, or there's various other sets of tools that you can use to do that. If you get them small enough that you are putting items in the description field, and they're relatively short descriptions, I guess it should be noted that you can store 2 gigabytes of data, I think, in the description field, so don't put 2 gigabytes of data in the description field. It's all text, so that would be a really big requirement. If you can put it in there and keep it simple, that's going to be the best way to go. Now, the discipline to do it, that becomes very hard to do. And unfortunately, there's no quick fix I can give you to just telling you how to do that. It's kind of on a case-by-case basis. But if you break them down that small, you can roll your requirements up to a higher level. So I can have requirements within requirements. So for example here, let me come back to, not this. not this. Let me come back to this for just a second. And let me do this. Group. Show all as groups. So what this is doing is this is just grouping everything. And you can see this big blue box over on the left-hand side is a user story. So I can roll these up, and I can actually see that I have a higher level requirement, creating a calculator application to support the expense application, and I have sub-requirements in here. I've got the division functionality, the addition functionality, the multiplication functionality, and subtraction functionality, which I've then broken down into tasks. Now I have test cases against the higher level functionality, but I've also got test cases against my subtasks, so I can roll requirements up. It doesn't have to be a do everything at once in order to deliver something to the customer. That's one thing that Agile teams have learned really well, that people are just starting to catch up on, and they're doing much, I think we as an industry are doing much better, right? This isn't all doom and gloom. We are getting better about how we do this. I think we still need a little bit more help, but we're moving in the right direction. So the decomposition available in TFS, you can go as many levels deep as far as I know, is a good way to go about doing that and keeping everything out of really long and involved Word documents. Other questions on this? Yes? Who's in the best position to write? So who's in the best position, let me see if I got this right, who's in the best position to write the test cases based on their knowledge of the implementation or not having the knowledge of the implementation? So in the test case that I wrote, there was nothing about implementation in here. I didn't put anything in there about implementation, nothing about buttons, nothing about screens. So because of this, I got two options. I can have my tester write them, or I can have my product owner write them. And the only criteria is that I can either pass or fail that particular test case, but there's no detail. Now you want a tester to fill in the detail for you, but anybody can write that test case as long as it's provable and theoretically the business owner signs off on it that yes, this is what I want it to do. Does that answer the question? Yep.
Test a case, they think he should, the tester should testing. But in reality, this is one person's job, write, or group's job is to write a tester case. So who is at the best position to write this one? I really don't know. Because if you do not have those knowledge on implementation, that you really could miss something.
I see. So the question is really around the testers having the business knowledge to write the test cases correctly.
Yeah. Do you require the knowledge about implementation, a technical detail? Do you need to for write the test case, or you just need to know the requirement, just purely based upon the business requirement to test the application?
So you just purely need to know the business requirement in order to test. You do not have to know anything about the technical implementation to write the test case. And in fact, most functional testers, most end user testers don't know anything about the technical implementation of the software. They just know that from a business perspective, it needs to do this, and they can click through a screen and make it do that. From the perspective of knowledge, how many of you have organizations where IT is horizontal, that is, they're not embedded with the business that they support? Okay, I heard a number of people laughing. That's not a good sign. We do that frequently, right? In fact, a couple of companies that I've worked for went through reorgs where the IT team used to be embedded with the development teams and the business teams. And it used to be that this team worked for this business unit, and they knew the business unit well, right? They could understand what the business was talking about. There's been a move to get economies of scale, turn that sideways, and so this team can now go work for lots of different departments because people think that's going to save them money. It doesn't save money, and I can probably prove it. Don't have the numbers, but it doesn't save money because the time to give me the business knowledge is so much more expensive than it is to have a team embedded with the business unit. In best cases, my development team understands the business. And, just as for example, I was talking about that spec that I was writing at the beginning, that I was developing for, the 600-page spec. That was for an accounting company. My wife's a CPA, and I needed to understand one page of the accounting manual, and it took her 2 days to explain it to me. I'm not the guy you want developing an accounting application. I'm just not that good with accounting numbers. People who understand the business are going to do it a lot better and a lot faster. Some of you can't control that. It's just something to think about there. But hopefully that addresses your question, at least in large part. Okay, yes. Okay, so the question is how do you implement something like this? Because it's a big shift in how project management is done today. And I will tell you, I have had my fair share of scrapes with project management offices that don't like me. Slowly and carefully, and put the knives away before you start. The reality of it is that it's hard for people to accept change. Even in some companies, agile adoption is really coming from the ground up because the top down doesn't work. They don't want to change at the top, but the bottom does want to change. It usually requires pilots, usually requires consultants coming in and helping with it to explain what the shift is. It's something that teams can do internally. I think one of the best ways to do it, and we've done this with teams before, so I'll tell you, we took one team that had been doing waterfall development its whole life, and they had missed every release date they'd ever had. Only they had this critical project that if they didn't hit the release date, they were toast. Like a large part of their business was just gone if they didn't hit this release date. The development manager, not his manager, but the development manager said, I'm going to change how we're doing this. And they went to an agile process. The team finished 6 months early with 0 defects. That's huge. They had never come in on time before, under budget, and with 0 defects before. It was like amazing. That development manager took his story to his manager, and that process of agile development is now spread through the company. Sometimes that's what it takes. It takes one person to say, I've got to go do it to make a point. And I guarantee you, a process like this, you are going to come out ahead because you're not spending all the time going back and fixing bugs and ending up with user dissatisfaction. Users still might be dissatisfied, but then it's a change request, not a you got it wrong thing. And a lot of times it is push and shove. And a lot of times it's an interpretation issue. No developer sets out to develop something wrong, but you want to try and avoid that particular thing. So I will tell you it can be done. I will tell you it's not easy. It takes a little bit of work. But I'm about to show you something else, so I'm going to move on a little bit, and I'll definitely come back and take more questions. I'm going to talk now a little bit more about what can be done without project management issues getting in the way. What can be done just by the developers and testers to make things work better between them. So when you break down work into tasks, there are things that developers need to take into account. They need to take into account performance, right? They need to take into account the abilities, the scalability, maintainability, all that fun stuff. They need to write their tasks so that they can meet the needs of the functional testing. Now, you may do it a couple different ways. You may use test-driven development. You may use behavior-driven development. You might use plain old unit testing or any other unit testing methodology you want to use. The problem with this approach is this. How many of your testers, how many of you who are testers who actually do testing and not development run the developer's unit tests? One person sort of went like that. How many of your testers know what's in the developer's unit tests? One person. So what we've got is we've got a set of developers writing a lot of unit tests and executing them and go, all of my unit tests pass. My voice isn't normally that high. And you've got testers who are then testing the application, and what happens? The applications fail the tests. How can this be? Developers are writing lots of unit tests and they still fail. Turns out developers and testers don't talk all that well when they're doing things. In fact, if we look at how developers and testers work, I put up a brick wall between them, because if there's not a brick wall, it can get really ugly. And they tend to throw work over the wall to the developers, or the developers toss work back to the testers, right? This is the classic, I used to use a slide where I had two boxers duking it out with a whole bunch of funny sayings above it, right? But it's the classic with the developer, it works on my machine, and the tester's going, this doesn't work, and the developer going, yes, it does work, and the tester going, these guys can't code their way out of a paper bag, and the developer going, well, why don't the tester come over and develop this thing if they think they're so great? Right? That's the kind of relationship we typically get between developers and testers when we get into this bug bashing type of area and finding all these different bugs. We want to change that. And so there is a way, using these tools specifically, and I will tell you, I don't care how you do it. I just want things to be better for your teams. That's why I come up here and present, because I think I can impart something that's going to help you do it. So it doesn't matter what tools you use. These tools, as far as I know, are the only tools that can do this. We want to make it so the developers and testers are actually working together, so that when a developer creates a unit test, the tester knows what the unit test is, knows what the values are, and can change the values. They can change the values that the developer puts in there, because maybe the developer's not testing the right thing. And maybe the tester doesn't have to test the whole application to find one dumb problem. They can just run one of the developer's unit tests and figure it out. Much easier for a developer to fix the problem at that particular point. But down at the task level, at the code level, there's a complete lack of cooperation between developers and testers, because testers would literally have to sit over the developer's shoulders to see what they were doing. So I don't know why I did that exactly. Let's do this, which is what I wanted to do. So let's take a look at something. Close all these different things. And this one I will tell you I pre-did. I wasn't going to do any software development up here. Looks too ugly at this point. So I have this application, simple calculator. You saw the requirement for it. Build a simple calculator. Definitely didn't want that to come up. Build a simple calculator in order to support the expense application. And you can see that I have a set of tests with these. And if I look at, how many of you do unit testing today? A little less than half. Okay, not a lot of folks. So let's say I have these tests. Let me refresh this. And I go ahead and run them. And these tests are all going to pass. It runs very quickly. It's what we want to have happen. You can see that even for what I've done so far, and I decided to stop at around 10 because I just figured it was going to be way too many if I started writing all the unit tests that needed to be there. That's a lot of unit tests. There's a add basic test, add negative test, add running test, add large test, and so forth and so on. I can keep going on with a whole bunch of different things that I can do here. That's a lot of tests. Testers have no visibility into what's in those tests. They have to go break open the code to actually see what's inside. And if we go and we break open the code, you can see it's your standard test method. It's got a couple of values here. We're just testing to make sure that if I put something larger than an int in, it doesn't crash. And because it's a double, of course, it's going to pass. The tester doesn't know what you're testing. The tester sees perform op add large test. Maybe I go and put in a comment with it. Maybe I don't go and put in a comment. At the end of the day, I still don't know what's going on. One of the things that you can do, I'm going to do a little bit of hand waving here. Actually, no, you know what? I'm not going to do a little bit of hand waving. I'll just show you. So I'm going to come in and grab this test method, add it in there. So I've got another method. And I'm going to come back to my test list editor. Going to refresh this. Okay, I have a test here. Now, I still don't know what's in the test from a tester's perspective, but one of the things that I can do So I can right-click on it. There's two options here, create test case from test and associate test to a test case. So what I'm going to do here is just create test case from the test. What this is it pops up test case, puts my title up there, and the method that it's going to be in, puts the name of my method there. And it's got a status of automated. So it's automatically test automation. And I can look at the associated automation, and I can see where that automation exists. And you can see the automated test type is unit test. The reason why I point this out is because I can do this with web performance tests, and I can do this with load tests. Things that have typically been in the realm of a developer now can drop down into the realm of a tester, or if you have a technical tester, vice versa. But I have test automation here now. And I can take this particular test automation, and I can link it to a user story. And I think we'll go down and we'll grab the, I'll add this to the requirement one. Okay, now, if I go look at requirement one, I can see that there's a test case associated with it. And I can put up the automation type to show that it's a unit test associated with it. Now we're getting there. Testers now have the ability to execute this, because once I assign something to a test case, I can run the test as a tester. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. Right, okay, so the question was, why am I excited about this? Because the way that things normally work when I do unit tests is I do a build, the unit tests run as part of the build, and then the testers pick it up. If the unit tests fail, the testers don't pick it up. Good point. What if the developers are testing the wrong thing? All of your unit tests pass, the testers get it, and it still fails a build, or it still fails their initial smoke test that they do. I'm getting there. Give me a couple minutes, and then we'll see if you like what you see. So I can come into MTM, and of course I added this to a new requirement. So I'll go add requirement one in here so we can see this. And there's requirement one, add the requirements to the plan. Okay, now my unit test shows up here. And I can go over to the testing screen, go to my requirement, and I can run this. Sorry, what was your name? Paul. Now, as Paul pointed out, this is not necessarily the most useful use of my time. Theoretically, the unit test should have all passed before I got here. And we'll give this a second and it'll pass. I'll come back to it. Oh, no, it won't pass because you know what? You actually have to check this stuff in and do a build. I can't remember to check in my code to save my life. I gave a presentation the other day, forgot to check in code. Let's try this one more time. I'm going to check the code in and come and do a build.
That wasn't going to happen again.
What?
Promise that wouldn't happen.
I did promise it wasn't going to happen again, so that's what you get when you get somebody who went to one of your previous sessions. I'm so embarrassed now. All right, so yeah, that test is going to fail. Yeah, error, go figure. All right, we'll come back to that. Okay, so this build's going. I'll go on to this next part of it because I know this part will work. So let's say we change that a little bit. What if we give testers the ability to change the developer's unit tests? Because testers know something developers don't. Or they've got a better understanding of the business. So developers may not know the business, right? Somebody may just come along and say, you go develop this. So I created some different test cases here, some different unit tests. And you notice these are slightly different in format here. So this is a perform op 2 numbers test. And I'm reading from a data source. The data source that I'm reading from is the test case. So if I go to test case 91, I can see in this test case is ridiculously simple, right? It's got some parameters that are in there, and I've filled in some values. And I've got value 1 is 5, my operation is add, my value 2 is 7, my expected value is 12. Any tester can come in here and change this any way that they want. And they're likely to start finding problems as they start changing around from things different than what the developer thought they were. So let me take this to a slightly different view. Let me come into, all right, just to make sure, I checked it in. Let me make sure the build actually, okay, succeeded. And let me come over to plan and assign the build. And close that. Save and close. All right, I'm not going to rerun this one, but you'll have to trust me that it works. So in my requirements here, you can see I've actually got, two different ones, perform op 2 numbers test, perform op 3 numbers test. So if I actually go and look at the perform op 3 numbers test, and I come down and I look at the test steps, you can see this is pretty simple. 10, add 10, add 10, 30, right? Theoretically that'll work and I'll get 30 out of it. But what if, as a tester, not going out of this, because that would be bad. Let's come back into that. Oops, right there. What if I decide to change this up? What if I say 10, add, what is that, 25? It's 25, right? Am I good? I'm horrible at math. Okay, I've got a new test case that I just added here. I'm now extending my developer's work. So I save and close this. I don't have to recompile anything because this is just a change in the data source that it's coming from. So I'll come over to test. Yeah, it's my error from before. And I'll just take this one and I will run it. We're going to let this run for a second. And this actually is going to find a problem. I either coded it incorrectly on purpose or on accident, but I discovered this bug while I was actually testing the application. Wrote the code first, probably a bad move. So let's just refresh this for a second. Anyone have any questions while I'm waiting for this to run on what I've shown them so far? No? Okay. I am currently only running the one test that's going to go through 2 iterations. Oh, no, only on this particular laptop because I've got an all-up VM that's running SharePoint Enterprise and SQL Server Enterprise with everything turned on. So, no, it doesn't normally take this long. Also, the test is running on this machine with the test agent and the build agent and everything else. Okay, it failed. So, let's take a look at the failure here. So I can look at my attachments for the test results. I can look at the result history here. Do I want to do that? No. Hang on one second. So this one, that's interesting. It failed and it didn't give me a reason why it failed. It did give me a reason why it failed earlier. So what we can do at this point, it should give me a reason here. I'm not sure what I did that it didn't give me a reason. But what we can do at this point is the developer can rerun this unit test. Same unit test that the tester ran because the data is the same. So if I come back here as a developer and I go, okay, this test did not work, and I want to go rerun that. Okay, so what happened here? In the assert.r equal, it was expecting 25. The actual value is 15. There's a lot of cases that developers overlook. The testers might overlook also, right? Nobody's perfect. But if testers get some time to just throw numbers in there instead of having to write code, they can actually discover what the developers are doing and where they've made mistakes here. Now, it turns out this particular bug When I actually wrote this application to begin with, I wrote this bug in here. And I didn't do it on purpose. I did it on accident. And it turns out that the way the calculation was being processed is that if you do all addition, or all subtraction, or all multiplication, or all division, it works fine. But if you mix calculations, if you start doing running totals that involve addition and subtraction, multiplication and division, it doesn't process it the right way because of where it's storing the data. I can actually now trace through this, figure out what the problem is, fix it, and give it back to my testers. You can't do that today. And the testers now also know what it is that I'm supposed to be looking for. They know what numbers I was testing against for my unit test. This is something that you can do today. It doesn't require management to get involved with. It just requires developers writing their test cases and their unit tests in such a way that the testers can actually execute them. Now, I'll come back to you, Paul. Is this something that interests you? Is this something that your testers would find valuable or your developers would find valuable? And I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be that, and I promise I didn't plan them. Is this something that makes life easier? Yeah, so excellent point. So he said, how did you know that this test could handle subtraction? So when I put in the operation, developers and testers have to talk. And here's the beauty of it is that if developers and testers are talking up front, it's a much better relationship. And unfortunately, some of this is psychological, right? Developers and testers don't always get along really well. But we want them to have that better relationship. So the way that this test case was created, you can either create it first with the parameters, or the developer can create it, then you can create the test case afterwards and data drive it. So there's multiple ways to do it. But it does require the developers and testers talking together. And they should be talking together. If they're not, if you don't have the capability of doing this because developers and testers can't talk together, that's your first problem. And if you can get over that problem, you're going to get pretty far. Yeah? Shouldn't what have been defined in the requirements? Sure, it could have been defined in the requirements, but I didn't define an outcome. I didn't give a specific. So, for example, if I'm a developer and somebody says, go build something that lets me do running math. Okay, go build something that does running math. I'm going to write something that goes 5 plus 5 plus 5 equals 15. I may not test all the other scenarios, right? Because how much time do we have to put into writing unit tests, right? This is a problem that folks have been coming up with a lot lately, is that, well, we don't have time to write hundreds of unit tests. We've got to actually build code because the unit tests aren't code. They're just more things I have to maintain. That approach is also not a right approach, right? There's a balance between what we write and what we don't. But the beauty of doing this is that while developers are writing code, testers can be executing it with various different values that developers may not have thought of. So this is why if we get the test cases first and we understand the edge conditions up front, developers will handle that. If you tell a developer this is what it needs to do, they're going to be able to write code to be able to do that. It's when you get into these fuzzy requirements, I'll call them fuzzy for lack of a nicer term, that we run into problems, and we want to avoid that. Other questions on this? Yeah?
One of the very cool things is that I personally have learned to talk a lot about parameterized tests.
Yep.
This will force me to do exactly what I want. Tests that are hard-coded.
Yes, tests that are not hard-coded. This method forces you to parameterize them. The other thing about this also is this is not in Excel, it's not in SQL Server or whatever. It's nothing I have to deploy. All of my test cases are stored on the server and I connect to that, so I don't have to deploy Excel files or text files or database files or anything else like that. So yeah, this provides some benefit. And yes, hard-coded test cases, especially unit tests, because developers can't see them, they can say, okay, well, it can handle large numbers. What large number? Right? Because if I were a tester, the next thing I would have gone is double dot max plus 1, right? That's what I would have done. So this kind of helps expose that. Other questions on this? Okay. Oh, wrong button. So getting down to the code area. How many of you are familiar with all the different terms on the slide? I hope everyone, but not everyone. Okay, maybe it's after lunch and it's the end of the session. So what this is, and the reason why I put them together as puzzle pieces, is because developers have to think about testability. I will tell you the sample expense application that I was going to use, it's actually a reference app that somebody created, and I was going to write unit tests against that originally. It turns out that the application is not actually testable because of the way that they wrote it. They tightly integrated the communication channel and the actual business logic such that you could not separate them from each other. So that was a small problem in being able to do it. They also tied the data access logic into the communication channel. Don't ask me exactly why they did that. So when you have test cases up front, you are going to be able to design, if you're taking that approach, such that your application can be tested. For example, how many of you are developers? I asked how many were testers before, but how many are developers? Okay, a fair number of you, most of you. How many of you do interface-based development, where you code your interfaces first, and then you implement them by classes rather than just putting all the logic in a class without an interface? Only a couple people did that. Okay, so in order to make things more modular, in order to be able to run unit tests that solve certain things, in order to be able to trace back to functional testing, you need to start writing interfaces. Because I can mock interfaces, and it's really difficult to mock classes without interfaces. Right? This is something that you learn only when you start going down the testing first path. Because if you don't think about how am I going to test this, you just write and write and write without any thought about how this is going to come together for the tester. The next thing is separation of concerns. Now I put 3 patterns up there. There's lots of talks going on about them. The MVC, MVP, and MVVM. All of them are about separating my user interface from my business logic from my models, which control everything, which have my data. If you don't separate those, for example, you know what, I'm not going to ask this one because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but developers who code all their business logic in the user interface, not such a good idea because it's almost impossible to test, especially if you do it in like an ASP.NET application, then you are just hosed. These are the types of things folks have to keep thinking about. And, you know, I'm sorry, what was your name? Nancy. So Nancy had asked about the PMO earlier and what we can do to drive this work out, to drive this change in perspective out earlier. This doesn't require anything. It just requires developers to think about how am I going to test this and spend a little bit more time up front. It may take longer at the front end of the schedule. I guarantee you it takes a lot shorter at the back end of the schedule. So other things, code coverage. How many people actually use code coverage? A few people. Okay, a subset of those people who are doing unit testing. For those of you who don't know what code coverage is the amount of code that is actually exercised by my unit tests, or by my manual test, that can be recorded as well, or by my load or performance test or whatever else I want to cover with it. If you have people writing unit tests and they're covering 20% of your code, that's great. All the unit tests can pass and your application still fails. That's an important number for testers to know. They need to know how much the application's actually been tested and what parts of the application haven't been tested. Continuous integration, how many people do that? More people. Okay, continuous integration is the first and fastest way to reduce bugs because you're going to find them faster and you're going to be able to fix them faster. If you don't do that, say you only do a build once a week and you've got 5 developers, well, what is that? 5 times, yeah, that's a lot of hours of code you got to go back, look over. 200 hours of code, yeah, that works. 200 hours of code that you've got to go figure out where did somebody make a mistake in order to fix these things. And again, when you're doing continuous integration, you can drop builds to testers. That's also part of the process. Gated check-in. How many of you are using gated check-in? Only a few. So gated check-in's a really cool feature. Continuous integration has one flaw. The flaw is that once I've checked it in and I've done the build and it fails, it's failed. I can't do anything else. Gated check-in, on the other hand, will catch the failure before checking your code in, so it prevents developers from having to go rush and go fix this bug, and the developer who caused the bug can go solve it on their own before they skewer everyone else and prevent them from being able to do work. So these are the things that you need to consider from a coding perspective. And what this looks like going forward is that as I go down this path, you'll notice the change there is writing test cases up front. And I don't put filing bugs after testing it. You may find bugs, right? The reality is you will still find bugs. You're not going to find as many. Your users aren't going to be changing their mind as much because you pin them down to a specific. Now I will tell you, pinning users down to anything specific is probably going to be the hardest thing you can do. It's worse than pin the tail on the donkey when you're blindfolded. That is something that you need to be able to do. And if you can do that, this is a much simpler stream. You're not going back and you're not doing rework. So what does it take to do it? People have to commit to things. So I wrote these as requirements. Managers have to get involved. They have to get testers involved earlier. And the reason why they have to get testers involved earlier is because you need those test cases there, and you need to reduce the bugs that come out of the back end. Now, I will tell you this is also one of the more difficult things to do, because what you are telling a manager to do is you are saying spend money up front to save I don't know what on the back end, because I don't know how many bugs are actually going to come out of my system. So the manager's got to take a leap of faith to do it. The only way you can really do it is by looking at previous processes, previous applications, and seeing how many bugs came out of it and see how you can do that. But every team is different. This works really well with agile teams because it's the same team constantly going through the cycle, so you can measure a like value. For developers, demand test cases before you start writing code. Say, I'm not going to write this until I know the definition of done. I don't know anybody out there who can argue with you. If you tell somebody, I can't finish this because I don't know when I'm done, who's going to tell you to go start it anyways? Okay, all right, people are going to tell you to go start it anyways. But this is a logical argument for saying, I want test cases up front. I want to know how I know when I'm done, when I've passed or failed. And it's not the user's happy with it. For the tester needs to be validating the test cases with the customer for the specific reason of giving an objective goal to the developers. The developers need to know when they're done, and the testers are an integral part of that. And once you start on this path, you will find a lot of benefits. And like I said, the only tool that I know that can do this right now is TFS, specifically 2010, TFS and Visual Studio and the test case management, because I can drill down into my code. I can look at the task that I'm supposed to do, and I can go trace it back up to my business goal, and I can say, is this helping drive the value of my business goal? Too often people don't know what's going on, so they just kind of go through life going, okay, I'm going to go code this without any idea of the ramification for what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Related content stuff. Questions? Yes?
On the slide, the code slide, you had the gate check-in and you had the continuous integration. We do continuous integration and thinking about switching gate check-in. What's the benefits of combining those?
So the difference between gated check-in and continuous integration is really simple. And I will tell you, this is a tough choice to make. I don't normally recommend gated check-in right off the bat. I recommend it if the team has a lot of build failures. If they don't have a lot of build failures, don't do it because there's this queue that the gated check-in goes through. So you want to avoid that queue because it can sometimes take a while for the developer to get the results back and they're just kind of sitting around. They can work on other stuff, but then they've got to do a merge and that sort of thing if they've got to work on the results of a gated check-in. So only do it if you're actually having build problems. It's part of the build. Yeah, it's part of the build definition. One of the options is gated check-in when you're setting the scheduling. This is 2010. Oh, I'm using Ultimate here, but I think that that feature is available in just TFS and Visual Studio, nothing special. Yeah, professional. Other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, say that one more time. So, right. So the So the question was, it's hard to determine whether or not a test is relevant or complete. That's an end user issue. And here's the thing. It almost doesn't matter if it's relevant or complete as long as the user says it's relevant and complete, right? So it's a perception issue. Unfortunately, I wish I'd like to say there's a hard and fast, but it's a perception issue. It really is. And if you can get the users to agree to it, you're going to be on a much better footing with them because they know what you're shooting for specifically. They don't necessarily need to be involved in TFS. They can talk with the tester. But yeah, if you can get them involved so they can be reviewing work items directly out of TFS, I say go for it. Other questions? Yeah. This process template was the MSF for Agile, but this works fine with the CMMI template or any other template that you want to use. Other questions? Any other questions? I got 45 seconds left. Yeah.
At what point does the UI design start getting talked about in this? And is it the tester that determines that? I mean, if they're writing all of the other tests that drive everything, do they also write that too?
Good question. When does the UI design get started?
I mean,
Where does
because
that
that's
happen in
important.
there?
I mean, from what I understand, you're saying is the developer just kind of gets the general idea and he just goes and writes and creates whatever he wants and comes back.
So it's a really good question. The user interface design supports a business goal, right? I need to be able to submit an expense application. These are the values that I need to put on there. These are the fields that I need to have. That gets done as part of the tester writing the test cases, right? You know which fields have to show up on the screen. And they will write the test case for the navigation. So, for example, it may be the employee submits an expense report, and then the manager has to approve the expense report. So somehow that expense report showing up on the manager's desktop such that they can view it. What I call the fluff. So navigation and fields I consider a core part of the application, right? You've got to be able to get data in and put data out. But the fluff, the button size, is it WPF, is it ASP.NET, I think that's entirely up to the team itself that it's going to make the decision. I think as long as it meets the user's business needs, that's easy because you can change out a user interface. In fact, I had one customer who wrote something in WinForms and they had to change it out for Silverlight last week. You can rip off the user interface if you've built your code such that it's modular and you don't put logic in your user interface. So that's why I stress that there, is that if you don't do that, the user interface is almost secondary. It may not be pretty, but it'll work and provide business value. And you can always make it pretty later. All right. Have a great rest of the show, guys.